A new study has revealed that certain groups of women are at a higher risk of cancer if they regularly use talcum powder. Here to talk about this is legal journalist Molly Barrows. I saw this study. If you read it, I don't know why Johnson & Johnson is all up in the air. This is great news. It's not great news.
That's right. It's a PR stunt.
It's a PR stunt. I guess the best they can take from the study is that the people running the study said, we don't have enough information.
We couldn't
prove anything.
Hats off to you, J&J.
Yeah, so J&J does what they do, and the media, corporate media, does what they do. Why does the corporate, if you look at the story right now, you're going to find that corporate media is saying, oh, well, this is game over.
Right.
For Johnson & Johnson.
Well, the headlines
exactly.
are so interesting.
The headlines make it sound like there's no problem.
Go out and
with baby.
Buy in bulk.
Yeah, put
it's
it on
okay.
your
No
cereal
connection.
in the morning. Okay, the reason they do that is the reason they do it all the time with any pharmaceutical case. Advertising money is so huge. I mean, I can't even, it would be difficult to even get close to the amount of money that Johnson & Johnson spends with
exactly
ABC,
right.
NBC, MSNBC. They pump more money because it's not just this case. You see, Johnson & Johnson's under the gun with at least 4 pharmaceuticals right now that I know of. The opioid crisis, we know that they were a big player in creating the opioid crisis. We know we've been in front of juries with this case, with literature that's overwhelmingly shows there's a relationship between asbestos in the powder and the cancer. So where do they go? What's the victory here? I'm having problems with it.
Well, it's interesting. Well, first of all, it was a U.S.-led study. It was U.S. researchers that produced this study. They said it's the most comprehensive yet, that they took 4 different government studies and basically used nearly 253,000 women. And what they found was an ambiguous answer. Their answer, the lead researcher, Katie O'Brien, with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, basically said, we set out to show one way or the other whether there was a link between ovarian cancer and talcum powder. And what we found was we didn't really get an answer. But what they did find, it was statistically insignificant. So they chose to interpret it, whoever read the study and wrote these headlines like CNN and NPR and Reuters, and some of them basically saying, no clear connection, kinda.
Yeah, well, I know.
But still at risk for cancer, especially if your parts work. If you're a woman and you have normal reproductive parts, by the way, that group, we did see an increase in risk.
Yeah, in other words,
the bottom line is, yes, there's risk.
If you're healthy, this can cause cervical cancer.
It can travel on up there and boom, sorry about that.
Exactly.
You know?
So, but nevertheless, I think the real story, to me, is corporate media's attempt to bend over backwards for their advertiser.
Well, they're like, stand by for these messages, and then it's, a minute to 30 seconds of whatever, like you said, pharmaceutical ad that's on there, and 3/4 of it is telling you about the risks that could come along, but they don't ever want to criticize
We know
them.
that 3/4 of the cases that have been tried against Johnson & Johnson, a jury that hears the whole case, not some journalist who has eaten a hamburger trying to get a story done and trying to please a corporate advertiser.
Right.
But the juries looked at it and said, it's kind of overwhelming that this causes cancer.
And that they've known about it for decades.
Yeah, what scares me is the media, again, does such a disservice to the American public.
Well, they just hit these bullet points without really getting into the meat and putting it in full context. This is just the latest study of researchers who could potentially be compromised. And I'm not saying these particular researchers are, but like you pointed out in the past, there's so much incestuous relationships between government officials and some of the very agencies that they're supposed to regulate, or the companies they're supposed to regulate.
Okay, let's assume that happened here. I can promise you we're going to find that some of the people that involve themselves with this are moving on to now work for Johnson & Johnson. We know that agency capture is huge. We know that biostitutes are out there that want to sign off for anything for the right amount of money. But let's assume all that in this case. It doesn't really make any difference. Kind of a moot issue.
That's right.
Because this study says we can't conclude anything except that a healthy woman A healthy
have an
woman
increased risk.
has an increased risk of cervical cancer if they use the powder.
That's exactly right. And plus, the FDA tested a bottle and found asbestos in a bottle of talc of Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah.
And Johnson & Johnson's like, whoa, let us
It's
test.
not our
we haven't
asbestos.
found any asbestos in our other bottles. So like you said, there's a lot of other evidence that's out there that points to the fact that there is a risk, that there is a connection between asbestos and talc. It grows together naturally in nature, so it's not a surprise that you're going to have even minute amounts in there. And sure, you might want to say, hey, we're going to give the industry some leniency. You can't have 0% of everything, even though you're not supposed to have asbestos in anything.
You
know, I mean, like, well, we're just going to be a little lenient on this. 1% is okay. But
well, this story to me is, it's the failure of corporate media.
To warn the public, to do their job as a watchdog.
Because an advertiser's money trumps the best interest of consumers in this country.
And it's
that
sad.
is the modern story of corporate media. Molly, thank you for joining me.
Thanks,
okay?
Matt.